Round three. Took me fucking long enough. And I think, unless there's a serious change in the angle from which he's arguing, this will probably be my last response to Epidemic on these subjects. I understand he has a few more videos in the works addressing other issues, and we'll play that by ear. It's just that at this point, I really feel like I gotta move on. You know, I gotta start covering other material. And I also think that my position should be clear enough at this point that anyone who's been paying enough attention will be able to predict my criticisms of any subsequent responses Epidemic makes. That said, QB, it has been a pleasure to respond to you, and I think you have a very refreshing, disinterested approach that I would welcome as a response to any video I make. So thank you. And without further ado, let's get our hands dirty.
As promised, I'm going to be making a very science-heavy video demonstrating that in fact we are universally hardwired to recognize that some objective values exist.
Well, that seems like a fool's errand to me. And I say that because the most you'd be capable of demonstrating is that humans are hardwired to value certain things subjectively, which I don't find all that controversial, actually. That's not the same thing as demonstrating that we recognize that objective values exist. I mean, just using the word recognize is already begging the question, since, you know, it presupposes that there's something there to recognize. Even if all subjective beings everywhere valued X, it doesn't mean that X is valuable independent of the subjective beings who value it. You haven't bridged the gap from subjectivity to objectivity. The evidence you promised to provide would support a completely different conclusion than the one you actually espouse. I mean, you're trying to prove that objective values exist and that subjective beings recognize this, but all you're actually proving is the objective fact that subjective beings value X subjectively. I mean, think about what you're trying to do here. You're pointing to a group of subjective beings who subjectively value something in order to demonstrate that it's objectively valuable? I mean, how are you convinced that this is sound reasoning?
Our moral sense is an inevitable outcome of normal growth, no different from the growth of an arm or eye. That shows us that our moral knowledge is indeed hardwired, innate, and universal.
No, it doesn't. Even if we granted these statements as true, all it would show is that our subjective moral inclinations are innate, hardwired, and universal. And although I don't even buy into that, it certainly isn't problematic from my position. In fact, it would complement my account of morality quite nicely. So, thank you?
Now let's go ahead and look at your objections against my original claim.
I mean, ask yourself if Hitler recognized any objective value for human life.
We are all hardwired to believe that killing a non-consenting human for entertainment is wrong. Even Hitler.
Whoa, 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 whoa. Nice sleight of hand, Houdini. But that's not what your original claim was, and that's not what I'm responding to in the clip you used. Your original claim, the one to which I was responding, is that all human beings are hardwired to recognize that all human life is valuable. I gave you an example of somebody who did not recognize the value of all human life. Now, your counter-argument that Hitler did not see Jews as human is equally problematic. I mean, you're essentially implying that while we are hardwired to recognize that certain things are objectively valuable, this hardwiring somehow doesn't include the ability to recognize objectively valuable things when we see them. In other words, Hitler knew that human life was valuable, he just didn't know what human life was. Brilliant design. That would be like programming a computer to protect against viruses without programming it to recognize what a virus is. Of course, this absurdity evaporates immediately once you admit to yourself that Nazi propaganda painting Jews as non-human was rhetorical flair, not an attempt at taxonomy. Yes, Adolf Hitler understood that Jews were human. He merely believed that their lives were not as objectively valuable as, say, German lives. And in any case, we don't need to speculate about the inner psychology of Hitler or anyone else. I mean, I can give you an example right now of a person who unequivocally denies recognizing objective value in anything, let alone human life. No guesswork required here. Not only does this person recognize no objective values, they freely admit that even if objective values existed, they wouldn't know how to possibly distinguish between those and the values they merely hold subjectively. That person, as you may have guessed, is myself. And I can assure you that I'm not hardwired to recognize any objective value in human life, since I don't. Unless, of course, you think I'm capable of transcending my own hardwiring, in which case it isn't really hard wiring, now is it? Now you have three courses of action here. You can concede this point. You can claim that for some reason I don't recognize that I recognize these objective values, which is still conceding the point, really. Or you can call me a liar. But I'm not lying. What I do recognize is that I value human life, subjectively. And that's all you're capable of recognizing too, and I'll prove it. You admit in your video, at 3 minutes and 7 seconds, that the value of some things is only subjective. So here's a challenge. Make a list of 20 things you value, 10 of which you recognize to be objectively valuable, and 10 of which you merely value subjectively. And then tell me the exact method by which you can possibly distinguish between the two, given that you cannot transcend your own subjectivity. If you have to use the Bible or any other piece of a posteriori knowledge to aid you in making these distinctions, then I'll thank you for proving my point, that this knowledge is not in fact self-evident, but predicated upon a standard you use that is external to yourself. If you respond that you just know, then I'll ask you to account for the fact that other human beings just know mutually exclusive propositions about the objectivity of certain values, like myself, and then I'll ask which of you is right, and how could you possibly know? In response to my point that objective value is an incoherent term, you made the complaint that I was arbitrarily redefining the term to suit my position, the same charge I make against Christians when they insist that their definition of right and wrong is the only one we get to use. But that's a false comparison, because I'm not redefining anything, nor am I petitioning for one definition over another. I'm merely pointing out an inconsistency in your terminology. The definition that you accept for value precludes the term from being called objective in any meaningful or coherent way, and you even prove my point. Take a look.
Here's the definition of value from dictionary.com. The desirability of a thing, often in respect to some property such as usefulness or exchangeability. Worth, merit, or importance. Now, while it's true that value can be, and often is, subjective, nothing about the definition prohibits or even implies that value cannot also be objective or inherently valuable.
Of course it does. Look closer, because there isn't a term used in this definition, desirability, importance, usefulness, that doesn't necessitate the existence of subjects to fulfill its meaning. None of these words describe any appreciable fact about an object by itself, like round, bumpy, hollow. They describe the relationship of the object to the subjects that perceive it and interact with it. Desirability in the absence of desire, which can only come from subjective minds, has no coherence. And the same goes for the word value. We don't know what it means to say that an object is valuable irrespective of anything ever valuing it. This is no different from pointing out that we don't know what it means to say that someone is a bachelor irrespective of being married. The term is incoherent. Meaning cannot be derived from it. And in logic, that's an easy way to tell when something is a contradiction. What can you possibly be saying about a thing by calling it valuable if you're not saying that it's valued? Well, finally, it occurred to me that the only thing you could possibly be saying about it is that it ought to be valued. Not that it is valued, but that it ought to be valued. And indeed, you confirm this in the comments section of your video. Quote, objective value refers to that which should be desired, end quote. And then, quote, if something is objectively valuable, then it should be seen as valuable, even if an individual has contradictory preferences, end quote. But here's the thing, that which should be desired, or that which should be seen as valuable, is very different from the definition of value you'll find in any dictionary, including the one you just used. So you are the one redefining words to suit your purpose here, not me. But that's okay. I can work with this definition too. The problem is, to say that a thing ought to be valued or ought to be desired does not describe the thing itself or any of its properties. To say that a thing ought to be valued is to describe something else about reality, namely that there exists an obligation to value this thing and its properties. Of course, the question is, where does this obligation come from? What is doing the obligating? I mean, you can't say that it's a subjective desire we have, because that would falsify your entire point. You can't say that it's the objective value of the thing itself, because then you'd be guilty of circular reasoning. We ought to value X because X is valuable, and X is valuable because we ought to value X. So where does that leave you? To say that these obligations just exist all by themselves is a vacuous, unfalsifiable tautology. I mean, reality would look and behave exactly the same whether these mysterious, intangible obligations existed or not. There's no way to distinguish between a world in which certain things have intrinsic value and one in which they don't. Now, your only attempt to illuminate such a distinction is to claim that human beings recognize objective value in certain things, or more specifically, recognize that they ought to value certain things, whereas they wouldn't if no such objective value existed. But you haven't even come close to supporting this claim, as I showed earlier in my video. So we've got several problems with your entire notion of objective value here. One, the concept itself is incoherent. It's literally a contradiction in terms, rendering it a meaningless, and as far as logic is concerned, false proposition. Two, even if it were true, it may as well not be. A world in which certain things are objectively valuable, i.e. a world in which subjects are cosmically obligated to value certain things, is indistinguishable from a world in which they aren't. If these so-called objective values exist, it's utterly inconsequential to us. And three, epistemically speaking, there would be no way for a subject to know whether the value of a given thing exists in the subject's own mind or external to it, since both of these are identical in the mind of the subject. It'd be like asking a blind person whether or not the room is actually dark. Okay, let's move on. 2 Kings 2:23-24.
The word you translate as children comes from this Hebrew word, and it refers to individuals between the age of 12 and 30. Elisha is God's prophet. Bethel is a town infamous for idolatry. The mob consists of over 42 young men, not merely some youngsters poking fun at him for his bald head. And it doesn't say maul and kill, it just says maul.
Okay, this will be fun. First of all, the word ne'er, which means boy, child, kid, youth, whatever, is only half of the Hebrew term used in this verse. It's paired with the qualifier katan, which means little or small. Other verses in the Bible that use the word ne'er to describe young men do not have the qualifier katan attached to them. So yeah, the literal translation here is little boys or small children. We're not talking about a mob of 20-somethings looking to kick Elisha's ass. That idea was fabricated by Christian apologists in an attempt to make this story look less appalling than it actually is. Secondly, nothing about this account remotely implies that these children are acting in a way that was physically threatening to Elisha. The children are standing behind him, not in front of him, intercepting him, and they're telling him to go on up, Baldy, or in some translations, get out of here, Baldy. Now, if your intention was to hurt somebody, would you be telling them to go away from you? No. And finally, the word maul, baka, in Hebrew does imply killing. It literally means tear apart. And even if these children were left alive after being torn apart, wouldn't that be a whole lot worse? I mean, I'm being generous here. So yes, we have a group of small children mocking a man's baldness, yelling at him to go away, and for this, God terminates the lives of 42 of them in a creatively brutal fashion. Now here's how you justify this.
God performed the act of having an angry mob mauled by a bear for the intent of punishment, to protect his prophet, bring about some greater good, or all the above.
So you give us 4 possibilities here. 1, punishment. 2, protecting his prophet. 3, bring about some greater good. And 4, all of the above. Now, unless we invent parts of this story that aren't actually there was nothing for God to protect his prophet from. And even if there were, brutally killing 42 children is an unnecessary means of accomplishing that. You said yourself, if you value human life, you should act in such a way that promotes peace and reduces human suffering. I'm sorry, but causing 42 children to suffer and die unnecessarily does neither. So I think it's safe to say we can rule out 2, which in turn rules out 4. So what about 3? God sends bears to tear apart 42 small children for the greater good? I mean, can you think of a circumstance we could call good that an all-powerful God wasn't capable of actualizing without violently killing 42 children? Because I can't. I mean, no matter what this greater good is, 42 mutilated children isn't a necessary aspect of it. Go ahead, try me. Name a desirable circumstance, and I will tell you how an omnipotent being could actualize that circumstance without this kind of barbarism. Now, in a last-ditch effort to save your position from being falsified, you may be tempted to say that this is nothing but an epistemic limitation on my finite human mind, that I couldn't possibly know God's true intention even if it seems perfectly evident from Scripture. And as it happens, this is the approach you took when fielding criticism in your comments section. Quote, "If we do not know God's intention, then any argument about God's intention is an argument from ignorance, which is a type of fallacy. Admitting that is all that is needed to falsify Scott's argument." End quote. Well, there's something disingenuous about this stance, and I think you're going to end up paying a price for it in the end because it cuts both ways. I mean, you can make your position unfalsifiable if you want to, but not without rendering it unverifiable as well. If, as you say, any argument about God's intention is a fallacy, then it would be fallacious for you to claim that God's intentions are ever actually good. Anything God does could ultimately be for the greater evil, even if it seems to promote peace or reduce suffering in the short term. So, unless you're prepared to concede that you have zero grounds for concluding that the biblical God is the standard of morality in the first place, I think we can safely rule out 3, leaving us with 1, punishment, which is exactly my point. You cannot argue that God's nature and actions are the standard of what is morally right for humans when it is so obvious that so many of God's actions would be wrong if performed by a human, such as terminating the life of a child as punishment for making fun of baldness. As I said in my last video, if you object that a single act can be moral when performed by God but immoral when performed by humans for any reason, circumstances, resources, capabilities, whatever, it doesn't matter, then it necessarily follows that neither God's nature nor his actions are truly the standard of what is morally right and morally wrong for human beings. Roll tape! Now, as it happens, you do try to make the argument that a single act can be moral when performed by God and yet immoral when performed by humans, and you attempt to do this by drawing an analogy between God and a fair-minded judge. Now, as I've already shown, just making this objection falsifies your response to the Euthyphro dilemma.
Just because it may be good for a fair-minded judge to imprison people, that doesn't mean it's good for John Doe to lock people he thinks are unjust up in his basement.
Bingo. Bingo. This is precisely because what is good for me to do to my fellow civilians is not based on what a judge does to my fellow civilians. You've proven my point perfectly, thank you. But you seem to think that just coming up with more and more differences between the circumstances of judges and civilians will solve this problem. You claim that a judge has the resources and the means to achieve certain goals, whereas a civilian does not, but this doesn't mean they're held to different moral standards, since a civilian would be justified in locking someone up if they had the same means and resources as a judge. But for the second time, QB, this completely misses the point. You're defending a proposition I'm not attacking. I'm not saying that God and humans are held to 2 distinct standards of right and wrong. I'm saying that what is right for God to do is not the standard of what is right for a human being to do. This is so obvious. We're talking about the difference between saying that civilians and judges are both subject to the same laws, which is clearly true, versus saying that a judge's actions are the standard of what is lawful for a civilian, which is clearly false. Do you see the difference? This time around, you use the additional example of an alcoholic and a non-alcoholic having a drink.
Let's say Jane Doe drinks a beer to refresh herself. No harm, no foul. And then 6 months sober, recovering alcoholic, John Doe drinks a beer to refresh himself. Now, he might not be able to handle it, and his action will cause harm. The same moral principle applies to both John and Jane here. Don't become an alcoholic. It causes harm. The only difference is that Jane is in a position that her actions would not violate that principle, where John's actions would have.
This example makes my point even clearer. Saying that the same ethical principle applies to both alcoholics and non-alcoholics is not the same thing as saying that what is acceptable for alcoholics is based on the actions of non-alcoholics. That clearly isn't the case. If a 12-inch ruler is the standard for how long a foot is, then it follows that if you drew a line the exact length of that ruler, that line would be 1 foot long, right? If for any reason we conclude that a line the length of that ruler is not a foot long, then that ruler is clearly not our standard for how long a foot is. You see how that works? Assuming your moral philosophy, the biblical God's behavior cannot be the standard of what is morally right for humans to do. And the fact that there are certain behaviors of the biblical God which would be immoral behavior for humans proves it. But let's be honest. As I showed in my last video, you don't actually maintain that the biblical God is the standard of morality anyway, because you believe that the biblical God is subject to a standard of morality. You even admit that if the biblical God were shown to have acted dishonestly, for example, it would render him ineligible for being considered the standard of morality. That's kind of like saying that this factory-made aluminum ruler is the absolute standard for how long a foot is. But if we were to look closer and find that this ruler is actually only 11.9 inches long, then it wasn't really the standard of how long a foot is. But that's completely incoherent. If the ruler were actually the standard of how long a foot is, then the revelation that it's only 11.9 inches long would mean that a foot is really 11.9 inches long, not that the ruler was never the standard. Clearly, the standard we use for how long a foot is was never the ruler. The standard is a 12-inch distance. That's the standard of how long a foot is. And likewise, you obviously use a specific set of qualities and values as the standard of what is moral, not some deity who may or may not turn out to possess all of those qualities. On your view, God may be a factory-made aluminum ruler, but honesty is a 12-inch distance. That's your standard of morality.